The Young and the Restless spoilers shock. Claire's brilliance had always been a quiet, coiled thing, subtle enough to pass as intuition, sharp enough to cut through situations long before anyone else even sensed danger. But this time, her cunning was something else entirely. It shook even those who had witnessed the depths of her ruthlessness. It wasn't brute force, it wasn't violence. It was strategy, manipulation, psychological warfare wielded by someone who understood perfectly that the mind could be a deadlier weapon than any blade. She knew Audra possessed knowledge, dangerous knowledge, pieces of her past that she had spent years burying under new identities, new stories, new lives. Audra had been there in Los Angeles, had seen the shadows Claire lived in, had watched her disappear into the underworld only to emerge reborn, carrying a different name and a different future. Audra held memories, evidence, fragments of truth that could unravel everything Claire had worked to build. And Claire understood a fundamental rule of survival: the most dangerous enemy is the one who knows too much. That meant Audra could not be allowed to roam free. She needed to be controlled, silenced, neutralized, not through bloodshed this time, but through humiliation and captivity. So Claire engineered a plan with alarming precision. She and Holden staged a break-in at their own home, careful to leave just enough chaos to be believable but enough missing pieces to point investigators directly to a single suspect, Audra. Claire planted traces, fabric fibers, a misplaced earring, receipts, fabricated messages. And she whispered just enough into the right ears to steer the police exactly where she wanted them. Holden, terrified of Claire but still tangled in her orbit, played along because he felt he had no choice. He feared that if he hesitated, she might turn her cold, efficient violence toward him next. The staged crime scene was convincing enough to trigger immediate suspicion. Police didn't hesitate. They went after Audra with all the force of an investigation sharpened by false certainty. Within hours, she was handcuffed, furious, shouting her innocence as neighbors watched with gleeful curiosity, convinced she had been caught red-handed. Claire watched from a distance, her expression calm, almost serene. Everything was unfolding exactly as she intended. In her mind, this wasn't just justice, it was control. Audra would be locked away, her voice stripped, her influence erased. Claire didn't need her dead. She needed her silenced, trapped behind bars where no one would believe a word she said even if she tried to scream the truth. But nothing involving Claire ever stayed simple for long. Audra wasn't the type to break quietly. Even in handcuffs, even with officers pulling her toward the holding cell, she kept fighting, not with violence, but with truth sharpened into threats. "I know who you are," she hissed as the officers paused, struggling to get her fingerprinted, her hair wild and her eyes blazing with fury. "I know what you did in Los Angeles. I have proof, real proof. You can hide behind your sweet little act here, Claire, but you can't outrun what you've done." The officers dismissed her words as the frantic ramblings of a desperate criminal. But Claire heard every syllable. She also knew Audra wasn't bluffing. That was why she had to act fast. She appeared at the precinct as if she had every right to be there, calm, sympathetic, the picture of a frightened woman seeking closure after being robbed by someone she once considered a friend. Her timing was perfect. Officers were escorting Audra toward the transport van that would take her to the women's facility where she would await her hearing. Claire stepped into her path, her eyes locked on Audra with a stillness that made the officers uneasy even if they couldn't understand why. Audra stopped mid-stride, breath-catching, not out of fear, but out of sheer rage. "You think you can get away with this," she spat. "You think prison is going to shut me up? I will burn your whole life down, Claire. I swear I will drag your past out of the ground and throw it in your face. I have everything, photos, files, messages, you're not going to bury me." Claire smiled, but it wasn't warm or mocking. It was small, precise, and terrifyingly empty. She leaned in, close enough that only Audra could hear her words. "You won't make it that far," she whispered, her voice smooth as velvet yet cold enough to freeze bone. "You think prison will break you? I didn't send you there to suffer. I sent you there because it's the only place where you're safe from me. Audra's breath hitched, her fury slipping into something shakier. But Claire wasn't finished. You want to expose me? Go ahead. See who listens to you now. A criminal. A thief. A liar. You're no threat to me anymore, Audra. Not out here. Not in prison. Not anywhere. You should be grateful, I chose the merciful option. Audra trembled, not with fear, but with helpless fury, as the officers dragged her back, commanding her to keep moving. She fought, she cursed, she threatened, but it didn't matter. Her voice was swallowed by slamming doors, echoing hallways, and procedure. And Claire watched it all with chilling stillness, her expression unreadable, her pulse steady. She had won. For now. But even as the chaos settled, even as Audra vanished into the maze of concrete and steel, there was a strange, crackling electricity in the air. The police were confused. Holden was terrified. And Audra, no matter how tightly she was shackled, was not defeated. She had evidence. She had truth. She had motive. And if she ever escaped, if anyone ever believed her, if even a single piece of that past resurfaced, Claire's entire carefully constructed life would explode like glass under pressure. For the first time, Claire felt it, a thin, quiet tremor of something dangerously close to vulnerability. It wasn't fear. Claire didn't fear people. But it was a reminder, she had stepped into the light, and the shadows she used to hide in were now behind her, whispering her name. Audra was in prison. But secrets weren't. And Claire knew better than anyone that secrets were the only real enemies that never stayed dead. Kyle hadn't meant to become a witness to anything life-altering that day, he'd just been in the wrong hallway at the wrong moment, cutting through the quieter side of the building to avoid a tedious meeting. But as he turned a corner and saw Claire standing rigid, eyes sharpened to a lethal edge, facing a handcuffed and furious Audra, something in the air made him freeze where he stood. He stayed just out of sight, half hidden behind a glass partition, and for the second time in his increasingly chaotic life, he realized that the people he thought he understood were wearing masks far more convincing than he'd ever imagined. He couldn't hear every word, but he heard enough. Audra's voice, hoarse with anger, spitting out words like murder, Los Angeles, fake life, and evidence, and Claire's quiet, controlled retort, low, lethal, and threaded with a promise so terrifyingly calm that it made his skin crawl even from a distance. Claire told Audra that if she dared to reveal her past, if she so much as whispered certain truths to the wrong ears, she wouldn't live long enough to enjoy it. Assassinated in prison. That was the phrase that cut through the muffled hallway and sank into Kyle's mind like a hook. It didn't sound like an empty threat. It sounded like logistics. It sounded like a plan. Claire mentioned connections, people in the shadows, men who moved money, pain, and silence like currency. It hit him then, she wasn't just being dramatic. She was talking about something real, something she clearly knew how to use. Kyle felt a cold, unfamiliar fear coil in his stomach as he watched the way Claire didn't raise her voice, didn't posture, didn't flinch. She didn't need volume to be terrifying. Her power lay in how matter-of-fact she sounded while casually discussing the potential murder of a woman already in handcuffs. That wasn't a corporate executive under pressure. That wasn't a girlfriend lashing out in jealousy or resentment. That was someone who had been here before, metaphorically if not literally, someone who understood how to reach into closed systems and slide a knife into the one weak spot no one else could see. And once you see that side of a person, you can't unsee it. Kyle had always thought Claire was intense, maybe a little too secretive, but he'd chalked that up to her past trauma and the brutal ladder she'd climbed to get to where she was. But the way Audra spit accusations? About Los Angeles, about a different name, about a past soaked in blood, and the way Claire didn't deny any of it, only redirected the conversation toward consequences, made something crack in his perception. If any of what Audra was saying was true, then Claire wasn't just ambitious. She wasn't just flawed. She was dangerous in a way that made everything else he'd seen in the boardroom look like kindergarten. That realization didn't stay contained inside his chest for long. It slipped out in subtle ways, hesitation in his voice when he spoke about Claire, tension in the way he avoided her gaze in the corridors, the way he lingered a second too long when Victoria later asked if anything seemed off. Because Victoria was watching, too. She had seen the report of the staged robbery that somehow led straight to Audra's arrest. She had listened to Audra's furious claims through lawyers and frantic messages. Claire framed me. Claire is not who she says she is. Claire killed someone in LA. I have proof, I have files, I have DNA. Normally, accusations like that would have been easy to dismiss as a desperate attempt to scramble out of a criminal charge, especially coming from someone like Audra, whose reputation was a tangled knot of manipulation and opportunism. But the more Victoria listened, the more she noticed a pattern. Small inconsistencies in Claire's story, unexplained gaps in her past, the way she always seemed prepared for every scenario as if she'd been planning for a disaster no one else could see. And then came Kyle's hesitation, that flicker in his eyes when she casually asked what he'd been doing near the holding area earlier that day. He wasn't a good liar, not with her, and that alone told her more than any official report. Victoria had built her empire on control, on foresight, on refusing to be blindsided by people she trusted. She knew better than most how catastrophic it could be to invest in someone whose foundations were rotten. If Audra was lying, then fine, this would pass. But if she wasn't, if even half of what she claimed about Claire's past was real, then Victoria might very well be sharing her company, her strategy, and her family's future with a woman capable of murder. And that was not something she could afford to leave in the realm of suspicion. Audra's wildest accusations could be dismissed. But one thing stuck with Victoria more than the rest, the mention of DNA. Evidence. A body perhaps, or crime scene samples, tied not just to a nameless ghost in LA but to Claire herself under a different identity. That part she couldn't ignore. In a world where people lied, manipulated, and rewrote history, DNA did not. So Victoria made a decision in the privacy of her office. Beneath the soft hum of city lights outside her windows, she would find out the truth. Quietly. Precisely. Using the kind of resources only someone like her possessed. While lawyers argued and police officers checked boxes on forms and transferred Audra into a cell, Victoria initiated her own investigation. She ordered discreet background checks, cross-references on Claire's history, subtle probes into records that had been sealed or lost, and she put out quiet feelers toward Los Angeles, into that murky underworld where favors were traded in whispers. Most importantly, she moved forward with DNA testing, on anything she could lawfully and discreetly access that might link Claire to a life she had supposedly left behind. A hair, a discarded coffee cup, an old file from a previous hospital or clinic visit, anything that could be run against whatever samples Audra's lawyer hinted were in their possession. If there was a match, they'd know. If there wasn't, at least Victoria would know she hadn't ignored a ticking bomb. Meanwhile, Claire continued to play her role with chilling precision. To most people in the building, she was composed, strategic, perfectly in control. She visited Audra in custody under the guise of confronting her attacker, a victim confronting her persecutor. But everyone in that hallway who really paid attention could sense that the dynamic was reversed. Audra might have been the one wearing the cuffs, but Claire was the one holding the power. She made sure Audra knew it, too. Standing just close enough for the officers to allow the conversation but far enough that they couldn't hear every word, Claire leaned in and laid out her threat like a carefully folded contract. If Audra opened her mouth about Los Angeles, about the body, about the name Claire used to have, she wouldn't live to see the end of her sentence. Claire didn't shout, didn't snarl. She simply laid out the pipeline of influence she had built over years. Men who owed her favors, criminals who knew better than to question her instructions, guards who could be bought, other inmates who wouldn't hesitate to earn extra money or protection in exchange for one unfortunate accident. She didn't even need to go into details. Prison was its own ecosystem of fear, debt, and violence. Dropping the hint that she had the means to orchestrate a hit from the outside was enough to make any rational person feel the walls closing in. But Audra was not built to retreat quietly. Fear flickered across her features. Yes, anyone would be shaken by such a direct threat, but it didn't swallow her. If anything, it crystallized her rage. She met Claire's eyes with a steadiness that surprised even the officers watching. She reminded Claire, in a low, seething voice, that she wasn't empty-handed. She still had copies, backups, digital trails that proved who Claire had been and what she had done. If anything happened to her inside those walls, those files would not disappear with her. They were set to surface, to explode into the world like a delayed bomb, and Claire's carefully crafted identity would be ripped to shreds for everyone to see: law enforcement, investors, media, Victoria, Kyle, all of them. "If I die," she all but spat, "you die with me." It was an insurance policy made of code and contingency plans, and as much as Claire hated to admit it, it was smart. It meant that killing Audra would no longer be a surgical solution, it would be a trigger. The tension between them thickened, not just in that moment but across every hallway, boardroom, and cell block their conflict touched. Officers grew wary, sensing that something about this case was less straightforward than it looked. Some of them had heard enough of the muttered threats to wonder why a supposed robbery victim spoke so fluently about orchestrated prison hits. Holden, still shaken and half-broken by what he had witnessed with his wife, watched Claire with a growing sense of dread. He had tried to run, to take his daughter and disappear, but roots didn't rip out as easily as fantasies. There were still legal ties, financial knots, and a kind of gravitational pull Claire seemed to exert on everyone around her. Even in his fear, he was entangled. And now Kyle stood right at the edge of that pull, forced to decide whether to step closer or tear himself away. Victoria, too, underwent her own quiet shift. When Claire walked into her office with reports, strategies, and that polished, composed demeanor, Victoria found herself watching her more than listening. She studied the way Claire's hands moved, the way her eyes never quite reflected what she was saying, the way she seemed to always be 3 steps ahead, as if expecting attack from every direction. It looked less like confidence and more like a kind of muscle memory, the reflexes of someone who had survived too many ambushes. And Audra's words refused to fade from her mind. "She's not who you think she is. She killed someone. She changed her name." On another day, from another person, Victoria would have dismissed it. But now, with Kyle's subtle unease and Claire's own all-too-familiar relationship with threats, it became a nagging suspicion that she could no longer afford to ignore. A DNA match could blow everything open. A mismatch could fracture Audra's credibility completely. Either way, the test was no longer just a precaution. It was a necessity, the only way to wrest control of the narrative back from the chaos that was slowly taking over. Inside the prison, the war between Claire and Audra didn't end just because steel doors closed. It simply changed battlefield. Audra, despite her earlier bravado, was not oblivious to the danger she was in. She knew exactly how vulnerable her position was. She was in a place where accidents happened and were forgotten, where someone could be pushed down a flight of stairs, poisoned, strangled in the showers, or left alone with the wrong cellmate and never make it out alive. And she knew Claire had enough resources to turn any of those possibilities from rumor into reality. But Audra had her own weapons, information, leverage, and the sheer stubborn refusal to let Claire win, not this time. She started talking, carefully at first, testing the waters with other inmates, with guards whose faces betrayed just a little too much curiosity. She didn't reveal everything, she wasn't suicidal, but she let slip enough hints that there was more to her case than a simple theft, that there was a woman on the outside whose whole life could crumble if the truth ever got out, that she might have something worth trading for protection. Information, even half-spoken, was its own currency in prison. Claire, on the outside, tightened her network. She tested her options. She spoke to people who owed her favors, floated the idea of a warning shot instead of a killing blow, just enough to remind Audra that she wasn't untouchable, that fear might yet accomplish what force sometimes couldn't. For the first time in a long time, Claire wasn't operating from a place of pure dominance. She was in a stalemate with someone who refused to fold. That alone made Audra more dangerous than anyone realized. This wasn't a simple good versus evil battle, this was a clash between two predators who understood the stakes too well to back down. Kyle found himself in the middle of this widening rift, torn between loyalty, curiosity, and the instinct to protect his own survival. He had seen enough to know Claire wasn't innocent, but not enough to understand the full extent of what she had done. He wrestled with questions late at night. Should he tell Victoria everything he heard in that hallway? Should he confront Claire? Should he distance himself quietly before the blast radius grew too wide? Every option came with risk. Saying nothing made him complicit. Saying something might paint a target on his back. And somewhere in the background, he sensed that the moment the DNA results landed on Victoria's desk, their world would tilt on its axis. As for Victoria, she waited for that report like generals wait for news from the front lines. Her instinct told her that whatever it revealed would not just affect Claire and Audra, but the entire structure of alliances around them. If Claire's past matched a violent, buried crime, Victoria would have to act legally, strategically, ruthlessly, to protect herself, her company, and everyone under her umbrella.